Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. Today, we're going to talk about the combination of a web browser and cloud desktops to enable a DaaS and zero trust security revolution. This webinar is brought to you in partnership with Apporto, and we're looking forward to discussing some pretty compelling technology that a lot of organizations will benefit from over time. We have a number of great presenters today. First of all, I'm Scott Lowe. I'm the CEO and partner at ActualTech Media, and I'll be your moderator and host for today's event. I'm also joined by my partner in crime, James Green, who is a VDI, DaaS guru, and also a partner here at the company, and Mr. Scott Becker, who joined us recently as a webinar moderator and has deep experience with Microsoft technologies and desktops and all that good stuff. And from Apporto, we're joined by Anthony Awida, who is the CEO, and we'll be hearing from Anthony shortly. Before we get started, we do have, as always, just a few housekeeping items. First of all, I already did introductions. Second, we have a $300 Amazon gift card to give away at the end of today's event. We will be announcing that gift card winner live at the end of the event. You must be present to win. And please make sure you follow ActualTech Media wherever follower buttons are sold. We have lots of great events that come to you, lots of great content. And please also follow Apporto, all their social channels, and all that good stuff. In addition, there are a number of handouts, a handout from Apporto you'll find on the Handouts tab, and a couple from ActualTech Media as well. So please make sure you review those. And if you have questions, we have $50. If you ask the best question during the event, you can win an Amazon $50 gift card. The prize winner will be selected by us and solely by us, and will be contacted after the event. And don't forget, for both the Amazon $300 gift card as well as this gift card, you must meet the ActualTech Media prize policy, which you can find at events.actualtechmedia.com. We're going to cover a lot today. Before I get started, though, please ask questions. That's what we're here for, and we're going to make it worth your while. So we love questions. I want to make sure I can't stress that enough. We're going to cover a number of things today. While I talk about what we're going to cover, though, I'm going to launch a poll question. And so while I'm talking about the sort of run a show today, we will have you answer this question. Basically, what do you use today? VDI, DaaS, both, or neither? What are you doing in terms of virtual desktops? Today, we're going to talk about a number of the challenges that are inherent with on-premises VDI and many DaaS solutions that are on the market. We're also going to discuss why a number of DaaS solutions can create new security challenges for people. We'll also talk about why zero trust and traditional endpoints can sometimes be like oil and water, why there's challenges between these two things. We'll discuss the challenges behind VPNs and talk about outcomes, operational flexibility in the desktop environment, equaling endpoint success, equating to business results. And from Apporto, you'll hear about how they solve some of the VPN security issues that we're going to discuss, how they avoid VDI complexity, and how they can help your organization to get a shortcut to zero trust, which can be a very difficult concept to permeate an organization. And we'll talk about shortcuts you can use to fully support organizations' remote worker hybrid work plan. And with all that, let's see what we have for some of the results for our poll. This is a good audience. We have a lot of people that don't have either yet, so they have to do something. So we want to make sure we give you the best information possible today. And during our event today, we're going to talk about some key issues. And the first one we're going to do here is setting the stage. And I'm going to be having Mr. James Green and Scott Becker join me for a discussion about what sort of things look like today from a remote work perspective, the zero trust and some of the VDI and DaaS solutions as they introduce potentially new complexity to an organization. So I want to start with you, Scott Becker, and I'm going to be just calling him Becker during the event because we have too many Scotts at the company. So Becker, we talk about remote work, and obviously everybody's been talking about this for a while now for obvious reasons, and it's really here to stay. Can you talk a little bit about some of the research you've seen that talks about what we're seeing in terms of remote work, particularly for knowledge workers?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. So I'll defer to the analysts at Gartner on this one. They just released projections publicly in June for this calendar year, and they're estimating that by the end of 2021, we're going to have 51% of all knowledge workers worldwide working remotely. So that's nearly twice as many remote workers as there were in 2019. And for those of you wondering where the U.S. fits in that, the United States is the leader worldwide with about 53% of the knowledge workforce expected to be remote in 2022. And one thing I want to make clear about Gartner is they use a hybrid definition for remote work. So they call a person who works at least one full day a week, they count them as remote. So it's a mix of fully remote and hybrid workers who spend part of their time in an office. So we're talking hybrid workers in addition to hybrid office situations where desktops are going to need to move from home office to on premises and back, and organizations are going to need to be supporting both kinds of environment. And clearly the surge is pandemic related, but at this point at least, the bet from Gartner is on a lingering effect that lasts, at least through 2024.
Yeah, and if we think about remote work and remote work more than hybrid work, we obviously saw the pendulum swing significantly to fully remote in 2020, and it's shifting a little bit back in 2021. But what you're saying is basically compared to 2019, we're a far cry from where we were, and this is going to be a permanent thing.
Exactly.
Okay. That introduces some, interesting challenges. We have to have infrastructure for all these people, and it really increases from a security standpoint an organization's security footprint. So that's something that has to be taken into consideration in all of these plans. At the same time, organizations have there's an urgent need around zero trust. They're looking for ways that they can get to a point that they can secure their organizations as strictly as they possibly can while still allowing work to happen. James, Green, in your estimation, what are some of the biggest challenges around people adopting zero trust principles and actually getting from not where they are today to fully zero trust?
Well, getting this stuff working and usable for all of your consumers, internal and external, is kind of the problem with zero trust, because in a greenfield scenario, the idea of zero trust is fairly straightforward and simple. I'm guessing that nobody here who's listening right now is going to be doing that in a greenfield scenario, right? You'll have to back into zero trust by sort of adjusting things along the way. And so the problem then is, one, a lot of the technologies you're using may not have been designed with this zero trust model in mind. And so you kind of got to twist their arm to get them to work that way. And the other thing is, in a lot of cases, the user experience needs to change, or they access something in a different way. And so it's tough to go from not zero trust to backing all the existing things into zero trust. And for anybody who's listening who doesn't know, that the idea of zero trust is essentially that many years ago, we had this idea of a network perimeter where you could secure the outside edges of the network, but everything inside was trusted. And that perimeter basically doesn't exist anymore. That is partially due to this remote and hybrid work thing that we're talking about, partially due to cloud, lots of stuff happening on mobile devices. There's many moving parts there that mean that it no longer exists, the remote work being one of them. But there really is almost no perimeter to speak of in many organizations today. And so zero trust is the idea of we can't just say because it's inside the network we can trust it. We need to say on a very granular basis, this thing A can talk to thing B, but not to thing C, and so on. And so when it comes to remote work, that may impact, for example, what internal resources a user can access unless they have been specifically granted that access, where in a network that was wide open, they could just get to whatever was internal that they needed. So, you got to be able to find ways to get applications that were not designed to work this way to play nice together. And that's hard.
I'm going to launch our next poll question so people can respond to that while we chat. And this is what are your current challenges with VDI and SaaS? And this is a multi-select, so please make sure that you select all that apply. James, to your point, zero trust, if again in a greenfield environment, is something that you can basically plan for from the beginning. But also to your point, these brownfield environments that are existing out in the world form the vast majority of the need to secure an organization, and that means you've really got to look at every single aspect of the environment, and that means that these are far more challenging undertakings than we would see with some other what we would consider IT or security projects. We're going to be talking more about zero trust shortly, and so I'm not going to belabor the point too much here. But let's get the results for our poll question and move on. So, lots of people have issues around reliability, the cost, and user experience. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at some of the things you're going to hear from Apporto later when we hear about these challenges that people are having with some of that they've seen with some of the solutions that they have possibly tested in their environment or piloted. Our next topic is going to be around some of the challenges that are inherent in on-premises VDI and traditional DaaS solutions. When we think about DaaS, this is basically desktops as a service that we've heard that term come in the way a few years ago. Essentially cloud-based desktops. And I'm going to start again with Mr. Becker, because I want to kind of get one thing out of the way here before we continue on. One of the things, obviously, that we've seen over the years is Microsoft attempting to do a lot of work around, providing desktops to people via the cloud. You've been covering Microsoft for 20 years as a journalist, and you've seen a lot of these things come and go. Can you provide some background on what they've done and sort of a little bit about what their new DaaS offering looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one of the things that I'll do is I'll talk about Microsoft loves to put new products under a 365 umbrella. So you've got Office 365, Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, and now as of last month you have Windows 365. And so just to quickly level set for those who sort of don't follow Microsoft's every technology and branding announcement with bated breath, you've got Office 365, that's the company's biggest SaaS offering. And loosely speaking, it's mostly Exchange Online with some SharePoint Online. All the Office applications like Word, Excel, et cetera, thrown in as desktop downloads. And then more recently, Teams tying everything together. And then there's Microsoft 365, which is another brand and has some confusing branding overlaps with Office 365, for different sized businesses. But a shorthand way to think of it is Office 365 with Windows desktop licenses included. And so this new kid on the block is Windows 365, which is Microsoft's sort of long-awaited entree into the desktop as a service market. There were some other vendors who tried to do that with Windows and got quickly slapped down about 10 years ago, and then there was a lot of sort of anticipation for Microsoft to do something. They're describing Windows 365 as a simplified version of Azure Virtual Desktop, the VDI product, and there are essentially two buckets of the Windows 365 products. You've got the business edition for organizations with 300 seats or less, and then enterprise for those with more who want to manage the instances with Microsoft Endpoint Manager. And within each of those, you've got basic tiers with very limited capabilities, all the way up to a higher performance workload version. And if you want to kick the tires on it, it's too late. They've reached capacity for Windows 365 trials, but they're supposed to start again at some unspecified date. But so that's the basics of where they are with Windows 365. But with your expertise, both of you guys, I'd love to hear what you have to say about what the offering looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk real quick to that because we have a few other things we'd like to cover on this topic as well. I actually have tried Windows 365. It's serviceable. I mean, it's what Microsoft says it is, but it's not, from an affordability perspective. I was surprised at how expensive it is, to be perfectly honest. It's not an inexpensive offering, and the deployment process is, I mean, again, maybe if you're in a larger organization, it's a little easier, but the deployment process feels needlessly complex. It feels like it could have been pretty significantly streamlined, but they chose not to do that. And there's still real-time performance challenges when we think about things like Zoom, which everybody's using these days, and some of those other sorts of technologies. So it's a good solution for, office workers, but when you get moves, beyond that, I still see that there's some significant challenges that it has. James, there's also, let's talk about performance in general in VDI and DaaS environments. And this includes, Amazon workspaces. This includes, VMware VDI on premises and Citrix and all this other stuff. Can you talk about where we've seen performance and complexity challenges, especially since you've designed these kinds of solutions in the past, pretty directly?
Yeah, sure. So, at the end of the day, when you are designing and deploying a VDI or DaaS solution, the most critical thing to get right, the thing you cannot mess up, is the user experience. Because when you roll this out, every user is comparing the experience that you're delivering right now with the experience that they have on the laptop sitting in front of them. And if it's not as good, they're going to be frustrated. And so what you're up against is basically deploying something that will have the same, low level of latency, high level of graphics performance as what they're used to sitting on the desk in front of them, except delivered over the network from far away. And that's pretty tricky. A lot of organizations have tried and failed. A lot of consultants have made a lot of money figuring out how to do this. And it's hard. Couple of big problems being networking considerations. Obviously, you've got to operate this desktop from the other side of the country, maybe, as opposed to sitting on the desk, as well as the infrastructure that powers these desktops. And that you have to design very carefully. And what gets a lot of folks is it's different than designing a similar cluster for servers, because the workload is quite a bit different. And so, IT folks who have spent a lot of time building out clusters of servers, of host nodes to host servers, will go and build it the same way and find out, whoa, the IO characteristics of these desktops are completely different, and the density is different, and the networking is different. So it's hard to get right. Also, necessarily, to solve that problem, it's very complex. And so you can go the DaaS route to get rid of some of the complexity, make that somebody else's problem. That has its own problems, namely cost is a big one.
The cost, and I would say location for, in a lot of cases, especially if you're sort of, particularly if you're looking at on-premises DaaS, but even with some cloud-based DaaS, the further you get away, the more the latency becomes an issue. So there's a geo issue in some cases as well. To your point about performance, we were joking before this event about, VDI, especially, there were these calculators that you'd have to figure out how many spinning disks you needed. And what you ended up with was 6,000 disks with 1 terabyte of capacity, just because you needed the IOPS. So there was a lot of complexity that's gotten simpler, but it's still pretty complex to deploy. And especially in an era where we have people that are not necessarily just working from home, but working from anywhere, the desktop really needs to follow the user in a lot of ways. So as we go from home to vacation or whatever, where we're however people are working, we want to make sure the experience stays consistent and performant, so people can actually get their work done. And that's that can be pretty challenging in a lot of traditional scenarios. We're going to move on in just a second here. Before we continue, I want to make sure everybody remembers to ask questions. We have one question so far that we'll get to later in the presentation from Ted Wang. But please, if you have questions, please ask them, because we are here to answer them. We're going to share the results of this poll with a question, and I launched it secretly. How concerned are you about security with remote and virtual workers? And the answer is not great. Only 8% of you said this is great. A lot of you didn't, and that's a concerning statistic, especially when we think about the fact that we've increased the security perimeter or attack surface of our organizations with a lot of remote work that's going on. Let's move on to our next topic, which is security again. So why a lot of the DaaS solutions that are out there can often create new security challenges. And this is going to talk to some of the things that we just have to make sure we can take care of when we have our DaaS solutions out there. And let's start with the client, James. Again, let's go back to your discussion in your world before. Talk about how people accessed and the solution. And I think that one of the things that's important to understand is some of these solutions ended up doubling the number of managed endpoints because we then had a physical and a virtual one. So can you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah. So obviously, if somebody's going to be using a virtual desktop that lives elsewhere, they still need some physical thing in front of them to access that with. What you see in a lot of cases is that the organization either wants to reuse equipment they already have, meaning, their most recent past deployment, they had rolled out some desktops and some laptops, and those are ready for a refresh, but rather than refresh them, they're going to turn it into just an endpoint for accessing a virtual desktop. You also see, a lot of organizations implementing a BYOD sort of thing where, hey, you bring whatever you want, you connect that to your virtual desktop. Even like Chromebook sort of things used as endpoints. So there's lots of ways that people can access them, but the important consideration for pretty much all of those, with a few exceptions that I can touch on in a minute, the important consideration is you essentially now have two endpoints. You have the device that you're using to access the virtual desktop, and then you have the virtual desktop itself. And so instead of having to secure 100% of the endpoint devices, now you have to secure 200% of the endpoint devices. And for, especially the DaaS solutions, like you mentioned, those are going to require a client to run on the device that you're connecting from to make that connection and do the rendering of the desktop. Those things, that is basically a way into the infrastructure as well, and becomes a security concern.
Yeah, and that has to be managed at some point. I mean, when you think about mobile device management or endpoint management, you're securing whatever laptop people are wandering around with this client. And so from a security, again, I know perimeter is sort of a dated term, but it's still valid in this context. You basically massively expand your perimeter.
If I could just add one more thought, tying back to the conversation we were just having about performance and end user experience and that kind of thing. If somebody has a laptop sitting in front of them that is a fully featured, say Windows operating system, and what they're supposed to be doing with it is firing it up, loading the client, connecting to their corporate desktop. They're going to do that for as long as it works for them. But as soon as they have a bad experience, they try and get on a video call through that desktop and it won't work. They try and, install an application, and you've kept them from doing that in the virtual desktop. What they're going to do is they're going to come outside the virtual desktop and do it on the laptop, which is really not something you want happening. But I can tell you for sure from experience, that's what's going to happen. So that's a major risk when you have that second endpoint outstanding.
Yeah, and that's like to your point, that becomes another potential entry point into the network. And at the same time, from a security perspective, we need to be thinking about compliance with regulatory frameworks like HIPAA and stuff like that. That starts to become challenging when we have more and more devices out there that we have to manage, especially if we have to start managing both the access endpoint as well as the virtual one. So those are things that I think that we can't overlook when we talk about the potential security challenges that can be introduced by some DaaS solutions that are on the market. One thing that we also did here is we launched another poll. We'll be launching a poll with each of our topics, so please make sure you pay attention to that. We love your feedback. And the question is, what's the status of your Zero Trust initiative? And 31% of you don't have plans at this point to start any kind of a Zero Trust initiative. Some are starting next year, and the other ones have secured either their network or their network and their endpoints. Nobody responded that they have end-to-end yet. And that's interesting because that's, again, I think the holy grail, the promised land, as it were, for what we try to accomplish when it comes to Zero Trust. And no one here so far has, gotten there. I'm going to bring a question up. And the question is from Eric Caverly, and James, maybe you can think about this one a little bit. Our management finally feels like security is a priority. Their top concern is ransomware. Should we be more focused in other places first? I'm not sure. I mean, honestly, the endpoint and ransomware that's where ransomware comes in.
Yeah. The top concern is ransomware. Should we be more focused in other places first? I mean, um, I don't know, actually. I might be a little bit biased right now because I'm personally spending a lot of time thinking and writing and speaking about ransomware, but I'm not sure actually what is a bigger threat to organizations right now than ransomware. It's the statistics are absolutely startling, and we've done a number of live streams on our LinkedIn page over the past couple of weeks about that. If you want to go find those, we share those statistics, but it's bad. And the other thing we're seeing in the statistics, besides how prolific it is how few organizations are successfully defending against it and recovering from it without some level of damage. A lot of them kind of partially recover, or you know, stifle the fallout, but not entirely. And so I'm inclined to agree with them, if nothing else, to say it's a top 3 thing that is critical, and the entry point for that is the users and the endpoints. So I do think you need to be thinking about that a lot.
Yeah,
And can I just
go ahead, Becker.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in with one other thing, which is there is one silver lining of ransomware, and that it's such an umbrella category. It affects so many areas of security that if your management is focused on ransomware, say great, here are the security solutions that we need all over the organization to defend against it.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been preaching for a very long time is that ransomware defense is a multi-layered defense. And securing your desktops, having a secure desktop environment, and a culture of security in your organization are really the biggest things that are going to prevent ransomware from infiltrating in the first place. Because the vast majority of ransomware events are because someone made a mistake somewhere. And it's not malicious, typically anyway, but it's just reality. It's humans. Humans make mistakes. So that was a great question, Eric. Thank you for asking that. I'm going to move on to our next topic, which is going to be around basically the endpoint and zero trust, and why it can be really challenging to get to fully zero trust in an endpoint. And we're going to start with what we just discussed. And while we do this, I'm going to launch our poll right now. So give me just 1 second. So because we have this is a really interesting one for us. This is for me particularly interesting because I'm sort of fascinated by this migration to work from home into hybrid, and so I'm really interested to hear what's happening out there with our folks that are on this event. We just talked about how cybersecurity issues take place, and statistics show that 70 to 80% of cybersecurity issues happen because of users. Users did something wrong, and again, it's not malicious. And I will give credit because the bad guys have gotten really good at their jobs, unfortunately. And there have been a few emails I've received that look really good and really legitimate, but aren't. And no, I have not fallen victim yet, but they're getting good. And if you don't live and breathe this and have a culture of security in your organization, it can be very difficult to fully avoid falling victim to a security attack. And let's talk about zero trust and endpoints. James, what makes it so hard to secure endpoints and get to a true zero trust model at the same, and traditional endpoints at the same time?
Well, I feel like a little bit like I'm beating a dead horse here, but it comes back to the user experience. You could very well just lock down access to everything and then say, okay, now send me a request for what you need to get through to, and I'll whitelist that as the requests come, and it will be a disaster, and you will have a horrible reputation internally. But so the challenge is, how do you start to protect these things without ruining the user experience, especially in a brownfield deployment scenario? It's really hard. I was going to try and give a piece of advice there, but I'm not even sure I have any other than we need a bit of a different approach, because zero trust in the way I think of it and trying to back into that without a technology that has kind of reimagined it is really tough to do.
And, I'll jump in here with talk and to kind of bring this back to the work from home thing. key technology that's sort of underpinned the work from home, or especially early on, hybrid scenarios, is VPN and endpoint security technologies and things like that. But one of the I think that security and complexity are polar opposites things. The more complex something is, the less secure it is, because people can't figure it out, or there's just too many moving parts. So as we have to add these layered technologies like VPNs, more endpoint security, more of this, more of that, I feel like there's an exponential increase in complexity, which ends up with an overall reduction in your security footprint or security posture. And especially early on, as people were struggling to enable work from home, it was basically just throw it out there and make it work. And then we'll add all this stuff later, but it adds complexity. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with you about complexity being the problem. Like we were talking about a minute ago on the ransomware thing, where users are the source of ransomware infiltration a lot of the time. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. Users are also the source of cybersecurity failures a lot of the time. And I think, I don't have a stat to back this up, but I think in a lot of cases that's probably due to complexity. If it were easier, it would be less likely for human error to have been the problem. But in an effort to engineer, a really solid security posture, we layer on one piece of complexity on another piece of complexity on another one, and it becomes really hard to manage and keep up to date by humans.
Yeah, and I'm going to tie this back to one concept we've used for years, which is this idea of least privilege access, which has a lot of which is one of the tenets of zero trust too, right? You have to get to a point. I mean, zero trust means you don't trust anything. You give just enough to what people need to do their jobs. Unfortunately, on the desktop side of the equation, to make things easier for the user, we've often just said, okay, we're going to give you local admin rights, or we're just going to, we're going to solve this application problem by increasing rights over here, or something like that. So we've had to make workarounds to solve user issues or make the user experience more palatable at the expense of security in some ways. So it's that's been one of the challenges we have around zero trust, and that's why we see this idea that these things are kind of not mutually exclusive, but why doing the endpoint right and doing it well can actually help you accelerate zero trust faster. So we'll get to that here shortly in just a second. I want to talk about the results of our poll and move on to our next topic. So this is not unexpected. In fact, this pretty well aligns with what we just heard from Becker, which is around 51%. I mean, that bucket there looks, pretty well where we are. So I'm going to move on to our next topic, because we want to make sure we have plenty of time. Let's talk about VPNs. And I think for this one, I'm going to first of all launch our. Actually, I don't have a poll for this one. So Scott, you have some thinking around some VPN security stuff you've seen. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So VPN security has been all over the news lately, and not really in a good way. And I'll just mention two examples where VPN security was at the center of a story. One is a set of vulnerabilities that FireEye disclosed in April. And so that, the security company had found a dozen malware families being used by multiple hacking groups. They were exploiting vulnerabilities in Pulse Secure VPN, and that was hitting defense contractors, financial institutions, and governments. And it was a sort of a high-end attack, relatively limited in number, by apparently sophisticated actors, but the malware included slow pulse that can get around a two-factor authentication defense. And the other huge one was the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack from May. And a lot of people don't associate that with VPNs, but that was the one that caused a spike in gas prices that you probably remember hitting your wallet if you're on the East Coast. But in June, the company's CEO testified, I think before the U.S. Senate, that the problem originated with an old VPN technology that didn't require two-factor authentication. So that's just sort of two recent examples of huge issues that have happened around VPNs.
And there's two more stats I'd like to bring up on this one. And number one is that according to Gartner, 70% of remote workers are still using VPNs in some way, shape, or form. And to your point, there's all kinds of news about where there have been VPN issues, whether that's an enterprise grade VPN tool or whether that's something you buy as an app. There are known security issues, especially with some of the other app ones that are around these days, app-based ones that are coming into the limelight that are not positive. And also, to your point about the Colonial Pipeline, 40 to 50% of cybersecurity hacks are use the VPN as the entry point. That's huge, and so it's an area that requires either a lot of attention or a complete rethinking. And I think probably the latter is where a lot of organizations really need to be thinking about going. So let's again. I want to make sure we have time to keep going here. So I'm just going to get to our last point. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but let's talk about basically what this really means. The key points that we need to talk about here are what are we trying to achieve with our endpoint environment? And we're trying to make sure applications get to users. We need to make sure we can have master images and variants that make sense for each individual user or user department. So we don't want to have the same desktop to the same people, and we need to make sure that process for managing those desktops isn't cumbersome and doesn't create operational complexity for IT that ultimately make things either less secure or less efficient. We have to think about things like application virtualization, the performance side of things, and making sure that we have virtual desktops that remain performant regardless of user location. Whether if that user travels from St. Louis, Missouri to New York City, we want to make sure that virtual desktop that they're accessing in the cloud actually stays running well. Thanks to James and Mr. Becker for joining me for this first part of the webinar. I'm going to turn it over now to the Apporto CEO, Anthony. Anthony, are you here?
I'm here. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can. It's your show.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. That was a terrific introduction, and I'm sure the audience agrees. So I think one question was posed in the Q&A, how long we've been around. And so Apporto has been around for 6 years. We have 180 customers, most of them based in North America. We use data centers across the country, data centers with Amazon and Microsoft Azure. We also host our service in data centers of our customers. We have obviously customers who, for a reason or another, which could be performance or could be security, prefer to host our service within their data center.
All right.
So one of the things we set out to do is obviously to remedy some of the problems that Scott and his team talked about. And the two problems the words we've heard repeatedly during the conversation are VPN and endpoint. So what we've decided to do is create virtual desktop technology that delivers all applications in the browser. And we call it a near native user experience, which means that our end users are using applications, very demanding applications like SolidWorks or AutoCAD or even video conferencing, and the end user should not be able to tell the difference between using his native computer and his virtual computer in the browser, which is very, very hard to do because the browser obviously is not always as performant as a native application, but we spent a lot of engineering effort to make sure that it does. For that matter, I have with me our VP of Engineering, James. James, are you on this call?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me, Anthony?
I can hear you very well. Thank you, James. And James, the first thing is that James is using this video conference through the Apporto Virtual Desktop. And I'm going to let him speak just in a few minutes. And if this video conference was using also video, you would be able to see James and the user experience, you would be able to see him as if James was using his native video conferencing capability. James, perhaps you can explain to us what are some of the technologies that you brought to bear to deliver this great user experience and make sure that everything can run and run almost natively in the browser.
Thank you, Anthony. So there's actually a lot of different strategies technologically that we've used to optimize this experience. So as we kind of heard earlier in the conference, there's a lot of obstacles for delivering, let's say, a desktop experience over the internet related to things like latency, the ability and performance of, like, for example, like 3D applications and having that real near native experience. And so what we've done here at Apporto is that we've leveraged advanced codecs like H.264, technologies like WebRTC, data channels, uh, and continue to push the envelope to ensure that we're providing the best possible connection to the end user, and optimizing that connection in the best possible way so that you can run a full CAD application, for example, inside of your virtual desktop and have it stream back to your browser and not notice any difference in that piece. We do this, and we do this in a secure way, right? Because we keep everything in the browser, and that's like a mantra that we have in everything that we do. We've reduced that security footprint to just being able to deliver a browser, and what's going on that native user's desktop is just not our concern, because they can't get in. We have that barrier there between the browser and their native desktop. We also support. We also have a strategy of geo optimization. So we have data centers all over the country, and so we're able to position users close to their closest data center, and that also improves the overall latency and experience, and giving that real native feel to the day-to-day use.
Thank you, James. In fact, Mike Kelly just asked a question that's very relevant to what we're discussing. And he says there are several users in remote areas of California, and they have low bandwidth connections to the internet. What are the minimum bandwidth requirements? So our experience is that what tends to be the limiting factor is not the bandwidth. We do so much compression that most of the time, even for video conferencing or watching a YouTube, we're talking about 2, 3, 4, 5 megabits per second, which everybody has in this day and age. What tends to be the limiting factor is the network latency. So if your users are using a virtual desktop and the data center for that virtual desktop happens to be on the East Coast, they're fighting the speed of light. Even at the speed of light, which is almost the speed at which the packets travel, you're going to have a network latency of 100, 120 milliseconds, and that has a huge impact on the user experience if they're using things like 3D applications or if they're using things like video conferencing. So this is why a very key part of our technology is that when a user connects, we figure out where they're connecting from using geo-optimization, and we connect them to the closest data center, which ensure that they have a great user experience for all their applications.
There's another question, Anthony, I think to be interesting is, this is, I think, core to what Apporto is providing is the question, do you have an on-prem solution as well? I mean, I think it's important for people to understand what this specifically is.
Yes, absolutely. We have customers who are using our on-prem solution for a number of reasons. We have customers who have to deal with HIPAA, who have to deal with FERPA, and they cannot allow some of their data to leave either their data center or geographical location. So we can deploy very simply our solution within your data center. All we need is a VM. And again, the specs of the VM depends on the number of users, etc. But all we need is a VM, and it'll be part of our infrastructure, an extension to our infrastructure. Okay, so obviously, the second part of it is that, we heard the Colonial Pipeline, and the key problem with the Colonial Pipeline was that they were using AD authentication, and brute force now is becoming very, very easy with all the compute power that the hackers have. So implementing multi-factor authentication is very important, but also implementing multi-factor authentication with a very good source of data. One where you have a lot of the information about the profile of the users. It could be for your HR system. Very often you rely on AD as your source of profiles, but AD does not have all the information. So to the extent that you can leverage, multi-factor authentication, integration with HR systems, you are much better off in order to deliver the right applications and only the right set of applications, the right set of data to the right users. And this is what we do. Any other questions, Scott, I should tackle before I move to the next slide?
Yeah, there's one, I think, an interesting question that is not necessarily directly related to the product, but it's more strategic and internal for organizations. And it's, how do you decide which users need VDI, which require DaaS, and which can just use VPN? I mean, what's the calculus that has to be made there? And how does Apporto sort of address that?
Well, I mean, VDI, here's the challenge with VDI. And we've, 1/3 of our customer base comes from traditional VDI. The biggest challenge is that in a VDI environment, you have to figure out what your peak workload is going to be. You're going to have to purchase hardware, software, infrastructure for that peak workload. And now that peak workload may happen 2 times, 3 times a year. So you end up with this very complex, very expensive environment that is probably only used 2 or 3 times a year. And when it's fully utilized, probably the user experience deteriorates. In the cloud, we have innovated very advanced auto-scaling technologies so that when there is less capacity that's needed, we stop the servers automatically without the users even knowing about it. And now we're not paying for it. You're not paying for it. We need more capacity. We add capacity on the fly. And now end users have a great, consistent user experience at all times without having to pay for that infrastructure all the time. Okay, moving along. So one of the things we've innovated as well is what we call desktop variants. And the idea behind desktop variants is one of the key tenets of Zero Trust is that users should have only access to what they absolutely need. So if somebody just needs a browser, a secure browser, that's all they get. They don't even have access to the canvas, to the operating system. If somebody needs all the applications, but they don't need access to the SAP GUI, they won't see it. It's not available to them. So in our environment, you create a super image for all of your applications, and then using checkboxes in a very simple way, you can say for this group, I'm going to publish those applications. For this other group, I'm going to publish those other applications. And it's very simple to manage because, again, it's just checkboxes. You have like a matrix, you publish those applications to those groups of users, and the other users don't even know about it. They can't even find it in their virtual desktop. The other thing that you can do is one of our customers is Emory University, and Emory University hosts the CDC. So as you can imagine, they are very concerned about data upload, data download, copy and paste, and whatnot. So in our environment, you can turn off a lot of the features that make a virtual desktop less secure for a specific group of users. So you can turn off upload, download, copy and paste, a lot of the features that can be turned off to make the environment even more secure for a specific group of users, but not for everybody else. Any questions, Scott, I should handle before I keep moving?
We'll take some questions at the end. I want to make sure we get through your material.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I'll keep moving here. So really, the one message, hopefully, that you want to keep here is that we've created an environment just like Salesforce.com. There is a lot of complexity underneath Salesforce. There's a lot of security underneath Salesforce. But you, as an admin, don't have to worry about that. Of course, you still have to manage the environment, but it's a very simple UI. All the underlying complexity is hidden from you. And this is the environment we've created. We've created an environment where from one console, you can manage multiple data centers, including data centers that may be on-prem in your locations. It's very simple. If you look at the demo, every time we show our environment to a customer, their takeaway is that it's very, very simple. We typically set up our customers in about 2 weeks. And we use auto scaling, as I mentioned earlier. We take care of the backup and the recovery. We have an outside firm of experts that's conducting all the time, automated and expert pen testing, so you don't have to worry about that. We deliver on your service level agreement. In other words, if you have a service level agreement internally with your internal customers, we will undertake that on your behalf. And one thing is our pricing is very attractively priced. We got started in the higher education. As you probably know, higher education is very price sensitive, and we are able to deliver the service at very low cost on a concurrent user basis. One of the things that's preventing existing VDI customers from moving to the cloud of those VDI vendors is that if you're using something like Citrix or VMware, you're probably paying on a concurrent user basis. If you try to move to the cloud, they're going to ask you to move on a named user basis, which becomes very, very expensive very quickly. We deliver it on very attractive concurrent user basis.
Yeah, I don't think you can overstate the importance of that concurrent user pricing and moving to the cloud. That's a pretty key differentiator. We do have a number of questions that have come in. I'm going to launch our next poll while we ask some questions. And I think this one is a very interesting one because application virtualization has, in a VDI environment, not even just VDI, but application virtualization altogether has often been very challenging. How do you handle custom applications? Can those be virtualized?
Sorry, are those custom applications, are they current applications or are they Windows 7 application or earlier?
And the
short answer, okay, the short answer is we can handle those. I mean, again, as you can imagine, we have now 180 customers. We have virtualized some 500 applications, and we have access to servers that run older versions of the Windows operating system, the Windows Server operating system. To the extent that those applications run on anything between Windows 2012 and subsequent versions, there should be no problem to supporting those.
Next question is overall reliability of the Apporto service. How many nines, I guess, is what they're looking for?
So our commitment, our SLA is 99.99 because everything we do is redundant in our environment. There's no single point of failure. If you look at our status page, we had only one failure in the last year, and this was caused by a network failure in the Microsoft Azure data center. We've had very, very, very few failures.
What about browser support? What browsers do you support for access to desktops?
Any HTML5 browser we support. We test on the 4 most prevalent browsers, obviously Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and Safari. And the underlying operating system, quite candidly, we don't care about. I mean, we have end users sometimes who will call us and they say, I'm doing something really quick here on my cell phone. So I launched the virtual desktop and I'm doing this. So we do see in our statistics that is, there is a sizable minority of users who use even non-traditional devices, iPad, iPhones, and the like.
A couple more questions. How do you ensure data security for customers working from remote locations through the cloud without having to place a significant burden on the internal IT team?
Like I said, I think that question really deserves a more detailed discussion. But if you're using Salesforce.com, you probably do not spend a lot of time worrying about the security of your data. You've outsourced that problem to Salesforce.com. Similarly, if you work with us, you will not spend a lot of time worrying about the security of that data. You've outsourced that problem to us.
We have a question that came in a few minutes ago, and it's: is there an organizational size threshold that makes it where it makes sense to migrate away from app-based VPN? In your opinion?
I mean, obviously, I have a biased perspective, but to me, in fact, actually, this is what you guys said, which is, VPN and security are a little bit like oil and water, right? I think I've been watching this, and in the last 2 years, there has been no less than 8 VPN vendors who have announced security exploits in their technology. No less than 8, even the very top ones like Palo Alto Networks and others. So to me, again, from a biased perspective, I think VPN are a huge security loophole, and the fastest we can get away from that technology, the better off will everybody be.
I'm going to ask 2 more questions. The first one is a technical question, and I got to find it. Give me a second here. It was around basically older hardware and compression. Just a second. Oh, there it is. When using compression, is the quality affected by remote hardware, like older processors, video cards, things like that?
Yeah, really good question, actually. So we use H.264, and as you probably know, the H.264 relies a little bit on the GPU to optimize the user performance. But even if there is no GPU in the client hardware, we will go back to using the CPU. So I think somebody who has updated hardware will have a slightly, maybe 10-15% better user experience than otherwise, but it's not a huge difference. We rely mostly on the CPU to deliver the user experience that end users expect today.
I think this last question that we'll ask revolves around, the sense I'm getting is that it revolves around people's reticence to allow someone else to access their data. The question is, does Apporto use our enterprise's data in any way? Network traffic, application use, files? Like, what do you need hooks into, as I believe what the person's asking?
This is your data. This is stored, in your environment. This is your data. We don't have access to your data. I'm not sure 100% actually, understand the question, but this is your data.
Okay. Anthony, thank you very much for that great presentation. Thank you for explaining how the Apporto solution addresses a lot of the challenges that James and Scott Becker and I discussed early on in the presentation. And we have one thing left to do, and that's to give away a $300 Amazon gift card. And the winner is me. No, I'm kidding. The winner is Don Rutledge from Texas. Don, we will be reaching out to you after today's event with information on how to collect your winnings. Thank you very much to Apporto for sponsoring this event. Thank you to Anthony and James Dixon for their presentation. Thank you to my team here at Actual Tech Media for putting on the presentation. And thank you, most importantly, to our audience for being here, paying attention, asking great questions, and participating. Everyone, please have a wonderful and safe rest of your week.